Medieval Europe is often romanticized, castles, chivalry, and courtly love, but behind the ornate veils lay chilling truths, especially for young women. Marriage was rarely a personal choice, it was a transaction. Sexuality was cloaked in fear, superstition, and religious control. For young brides, the wedding night was less about passion and more about performance, obedience, and blood-stained proof of purity. This video peels back the layers of myth to expose the disturbing expectations surrounding sex, hygiene, and piety. We will uncover how female bodies became battlegrounds, ritualized, examined, and often broken in the name of virtue, family, and God. The wedding night. In the medieval world, the wedding night was a grim turning point in the life of a young woman. It marked the end of her childhood and the beginning of a life dictated by duty, submission, and silence. Marriage was not about love, it was about alliances, economics, and above all, control. And that control manifested most starkly behind closed doors. The bride, often inexperienced, was expected to perform a role she neither chose nor understood. Sexual education was virtually non-existent. Mothers rarely offered guidance, and if they did, it came laced with fear, modesty, or scripture. What awaited the bride was often terrifying, but what made the wedding night even more horrifying was the absence of privacy. In many noble households and peasant villages alike, the consummation of marriage was treated not as a personal act, but as a public obligation. The bedding ceremony was not folklore, it was real. Guests would follow the couple to the bedchamber, cheering, singing bawdy songs, and sometimes giving graphic instruction. In royal courts, high-ranking officials would actually witness the couple entering bed and remain nearby to confirm the act had taken place. What followed was often violent. The expectation was brutal and straightforward. The girl must bleed. A blood-stained sheet became the proof of her virtue and the legitimacy of the marriage. If no blood appeared, suspicion fell immediately. Not on the husband's performance, but on the girl's purity. The very real possibility that the hymen might not bleed, or might not exist due to natural variation or prior physical activity, was ignored entirely. The consequence? Accusations, disgrace, annulment, or worse. And the husband? He was given full control. Sex was not just a right, it was a requirement. Canon law dictated that a wife must not withhold sex from her husband, even under pain or fear. Refusal was considered a sin. Some clerics even advised husbands to treat their wives like a possession. He can be gentle if he chooses, or harshly if necessary. For the young bride, the wedding night often felt more like an assault sanctioned by church and state than a celebration of union. Yet the horror didn't end that night. The consummation was merely the beginning of repeated encounters, expected, unspoken, and mostly unkind. Her body now belonged to someone else. The psychological and physical toll of that first night would echo through the woman's daily existence. And while society placed immense value on this so-called sacred act, it showed little concern for what came afterward. Religion and sex. If medieval sexual hygiene controlled the female body, religion targeted the soul. For women, especially the newly married, sexuality was not just a private matter, it was a moral battlefield, constantly scrutinized by the church. Every desire, every impulse, even every thought was monitored under the iron gaze of religious doctrine, and it was almost always the woman who bore the blame. The church taught that sex was a necessary evil, permissible only within marriage and only for the purpose of reproduction. Pleasure was a sin, and female pleasure was particularly suspect. While men were seen as spiritually weak, women were believed to be the origin of lust. Eve's legacy, passed down through generations. This belief wasn't just metaphorical, it shaped confessional practices, public sermons, and private lives. Young brides were instructed to confess not only physical acts but also sinful thoughts. Desiring one's husband too much, enjoying intercourse, or initiating it were all seen as moral failings. Confessors, usually male priests, would ask intrusive questions during confession. Did you feel pleasure? Did you resist him enough? Did you enjoy the act? These weren't optional. Refusal to answer was considered spiritual defiance. But these weren't merely spiritual disciplines. They were mechanisms of psychological control. Women, already worn by the physical humiliations of marriage and hygiene rituals, now found themselves spiritually gaslighted. Even marital sex, already painful, often non-consensual, was to be repented for if it sparked too much passion. Religious texts warned women that demons thrived in lustful bodies. Some were told that Satan whispered to them in moments of desire. To guard against this, some were prescribed extreme penance, fasting, wearing sackcloth, even self-flagellation. In monastic communities, nuns who expressed sexual distress were sometimes subjected to exorcisms, rituals meant to purge the body of unclean spirits, often through touch, chanting, and forced prayer. Confession, instead of offering healing, became a space where male clergy gained access to women's most intimate experiences. The power imbalance was immense. Priests were spiritual fathers and social authorities. A woman who confessed too little might be accused of withholding too much, and she risked punishment. Bizarre sexual hygiene. Following the traumatic confession of sexual life, medieval women were expected to maintain a form of hygiene that was anything but hygienic by modern standards. Female hygiene in the Middle Ages was driven more by superstition than science. The female reproductive system was considered mysterious, volatile, and prone to disease. Medical texts, written mainly by men and copied by monks, warned of wombs that could wander if not weighed down by intercourse or childbirth. The uterus was seen as both sacred and dangerous, a vessel for life, but also a source of impurity and evil if left unchecked. To keep their bodies pure, women were subjected to peculiar ritual. One common practice was vaginal fumigation. Women were instructed to squat over bowls of smoldering herbs, garlic, rosemary, and even dried dung to allow smoke to enter their body and cleanse it from sin or disease. This wasn't a one-time treatment. It was routine, especially for new brides. Midwives and elders often performed these fumigations without consent, believing it was their duty to prepare the body for childbirth or prevent demonic possession. Another method involved applying pungent substances like vinegar or onion paste directly into the vagina. Some prescriptions included mixing wine with crushed beetles or goat fat. The result was usually irritation, infections, or long-term damage, though women rarely complained. Pain was expected, a quiet tax for being born female. Even more unsettling was the use of leeches. Advised by physicians trained in the Greco-Arab tradition of balancing humors, some women had leeches placed on or inside the vaginal walls to draw out bad blood or regulate menstruation. In other cases, hot wax was poured near the vulva to seal spiritual weakness. These practices weren't considered fringe, they were endorsed by religious and medical authorities alike. Of course, all of this hygiene had little to do with actual cleanliness. Bathing was rare and often discouraged, especially for women. Too much water, it was said, could stir carnal desires. Public bathhouses became synonymous with prostitution, and respectable women were advised to avoid them. Instead, they were given cloth soaked in wine or urine to wipe themselves. These bizarre rituals weren't just medical failing, they were part of a larger system of control. Women's bodies were treated as impure, dangerous, and in constant need of correction. Sexual hygiene became a tool to shame, suppress, and condition them into obedience. The virginity fetish. In medieval Europe, a woman's worth was weighed not by her intellect or character, but by an invisible barrier, the hymen. Virginity was not merely a virtue, it was a form of currency, a proof of family honor, and a spiritual requirement. From the moment a girl was born, expectations began to build toward that singular bloody moment on her wedding night. It was not enough to be innocent, she had to prove it, visibly and physically. Virginity wasn't just a personal matter, it was a public obsession. Entire families hinged their reputations on a daughter's chastity. Marriage contracts, dowries, and even political alliances were negotiated under the unspoken agreement that the bride was untouched. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. Land, titles, and inheritance rested on the assurance that a bride brought no trace of another man's seed. The church reinforced this obsession. Virginity was praised from the pulpit as the highest feminine ideal. The Virgin Mary wasn't just honored, she was held up as the gold standard for all women, despite her divine exception. Brides were expected to emulate her purity, even as they stepped into the very act that would strip it away. What's more disturbing is that this obsession didn't stop at marriage. Widows and unmarried women were often treated with suspicion simply for not fitting the mold. If she was not a virgin, she was a temptress. If she was a virgin too long, she was unnatural. There was no safe ground. But virginity was only one half of the horror. What happened to women accused of violating these ideals, whether true or not, was even more brutal. When sex was a spectacle. In a medieval society, accusations of impurity could quickly become a public performance. When a woman's chastity or faithfulness was called into question, the consequences weren't just private, they were staged, humiliating, and violent. In medieval Europe, sexual suspicion wasn't solved in quiet corners, it was dragged into public squares, cloisters, and even churches. One of the most disturbing practices was the trial by ordeal. These were crude, painful tests meant to determine guilt through divine judgment. A woman accused of infidelity, adultery, or premarital sex might be forced to walk across burning coals or plunge her arm into boiling water. If she emerged unscathed, God had deemed her innocent. If not, the injury was considered divine proof of her guilt. There was no win, just survival or condemnation, and even passing the test didn't guarantee her safety. Whispers could last a lifetime. In some regions, particularly rural areas, women were subjected to chastity inspections. Midwives or clergy-approved matrons would examine the accused for signs of prior intercourse. These invasive and degrading procedures were based on superstition, not science, and rarely protected the innocent. They served to shame and control, reinforcing the idea that a woman's body was public property the moment doubt was cast upon it. Worse still were the spiritual responses to female desire, especially when women expressed sexual distress, trauma, or even natural attraction. Religious authorities often interpreted these signs as symptoms of demonic possession. The remedy? Exorcism, but these were not the dramatic Hollywood-style ritual. Medieval exorcisms could be quiet, drawn out, and deeply abusive. Priests would isolate the woman, starve her, beat her, or bless her body with oil and relics. Some even touched or rubbed intimate areas to drive out the sin, blurring the line between healing and assault. Cases were documented where women, often nuns or young brides, were tied down during these rituals. Their cries were dismissed as the devil resisting purification. In reality, they were women in pain, physically and psychologically violated under the name of divine mercy. Religious texts of the time described lust as a serpent in the belly, and exorcisms were meant to cut the snake out. It was theology weaponized against the female body. The spectacle wasn't limited to religious spaces. Communities often watched these ordeals, whispering, mocking, or praying, depending on their mood. But silence was rare. A woman accused of sexual sin was never allowed to vanish. She became a story, a cautionary tale, a walking warning to other women to behave, to obey, to remain silent. Medieval society stripped women of agency, turning their sexuality into a tool for control, shame, and spectacle. From bizarre rituals to brutal ordeals, the female body was rarely her own. Yet through silence and survival, many endured, resisted, and passed down untold stories. Today, we owe it to them to confront these dark truths and question the systems that still echo them. If this video opened your eyes, like, share, and subscribe for more untold histories. Drop a comment below. What shocked you most about medieval sexuality?